Movies in the 2000s. A personal evaluation. The 2000s were a strange decade for movies. I grew up with 80s and 90s movies, and of course even 70s movies to a degree. 80s movies remain my favorite, though the 90s are a very close second, and the 70s contain a multitude of absolute classics that are among my favorites of all time, including the Roger Moore James Bond movies and seminal horror classics such as Halloween, Alien, and Black Christmas. The 2000s, however, were a very different kettle of fish. As I noted in another video, the style of movies were changing and actors were also undergoing a generational turnover, with legends such as Sean Connery retiring and even Arnold Schwarzenegger disappearing from the movie scene in the early years of the 2000s, with the few pictures he did release up to 2003 being among the weakest in his filmography, including the weakest of the iconic Terminator series with him in it. The 2000s saw my interest in movies and going to the cinema plummeting to an alarming degree, as not only did less and less seem to be coming out that I had any particular interest in even watching, but on those occasions that I could be bothered to drag myself to the local movie theater, I often invariably ended up coming out feeling deflated, disappointed, and not at all sure why I kept making the effort. But what about now? It's been over 7 years since the end of the 2000s, a ripe time to look back and reassess the decade in the cold hard light of day. I did something different with my Blu-ray and DVD movie collection the other day, separating the top 5 shelves of my largest bookcase to give one shelf each to all of the best movies from each decade of the last 50 years. Looking at the 2000s, not only is the decade noticeably weaker than the 70s, 80s, 90s and even the 2010s, but the kind of movies I was into in that decade also show a marked difference from the standard. There are a much greater number of non-American and even non-English language films in my best of 2000s collection, including the likes of the excellent vampire film Let the Right One In, the adrenaline-fueled found footage zombie horror wreck, Darkness, the moody French coming-of-age drama Water Lilies, and the quirky Amélie. British movies made something of a comeback with Hot Fuzz, In Bruges, and fantastic comedy horror such as Severance and Shaun of the Dead. When American films are included, they tend to often be considerably different from the previous norm of action and horror flicks, being altogether quirkier affairs such as The Royal Tenenbaums, Bubba Hotep, in which an elderly Elvis and JFK don't ask, team up against a murderous mummy, The Time and Mind-Bending Mystery of Donnie Darko, and the ridiculously silly but utterly delightful Debs, a mix of absurd spy spoof and lesbian romantic comedy that shouldn't work at all, but absolutely fucking does. Of course, some of the more standard and bigger blockbuster fare does come into it to a degree, including the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy and the Harry Potter movies, whose greatest contribution to cinema and the world will always be giving us the gloriousness that is Miss Emma Watson. Praise be to the Lord for that. The Potter films themselves are a mixed bag, and being the contrary bastard that you all know and love, I've never really been much of a fan of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban or Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, while thinking the very first one, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, or Sorcerer's Stone if you're in America and don't know what a philosopher is actually the most innocently entertaining, and that the best of the series, or at least the best of the first 6 films that were released in the 2000s, is actually the much pacier and more dramatically satisfying Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. By this point in the series all of the young leads are well and truly 100% settled and convincing in their roles, and the picture also introduces 2 of the film's best side characters in the batshit crazy Bellatrix Lestrange and the rather adorable Luna Lovegood. But that's just me. But anyway, aside from that, many of the really big franchises and Hollywood movies just really bored the hell out of me during this decade. The James Bond movies started off with Pierce Brosnan doing bad Roger Moore movie parodies, see The Fantastic Kingsman: The Secret Service for how to do that properly, and then just gave up entirely and decided to be Jason Bourne films instead with the casting of the utterly charmless and wooden Daniel Craig. Speaking of the Jason Bourne franchise, I always found those films deeply tedious, humorless, overrated and dull, and was of the same opinion about the Christopher Nolan-directed Batman movies, which never particularly appealed in any way, including down to the leading man, Christian Bale, who I've always regarded as an incredibly cold actor with the screen presence and warmth of a several-days-old corpse. When the big movies of the decade weren't being dour, depressing and dull, they were otherwise being overloaded with massive fake CGI that made everything on the screen look like a fucking video game, something that made my eyes glaze over every time with depressing regularity. The Lord of the Rings trilogy and Pirates of the Caribbean films were great examples of overblown franchises that did precisely fuck all for me. Of the past 5 decades of movies, including the current decade, which obviously still has a way to go but which has demonstrated a marked improvement at least in action and horror films, even if comedy is at a worse point than ever before, and the decade still lingers some way behind the 70s, 80s and 90s, the 2000s are definitely my least favorite. There is certainly good in the decade, as with many of those pictures noted in this video, but a whole lot less than the others and precious few that truly stand out from the crowd in my all-time favorites list. As a whole, as a movie decade, I can't honestly give the 2000s anything higher than a C.